We now move on once again. There's been a new breakthrough in US-China trade negotiations. Officials from both countries say they've reached a framework aimed at stabilizing their trade relationship and lifting China's export restrictions on rare earth minerals. The announcement follows 2 days of intensive talks in London. US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick described the deal as giving substance to a preliminary agreement reached last month in Geneva. That earlier effort had faced setbacks due to China's continued limits on exports of critical minerals, a move that prompted the US to impose its own restrictions on key technology exports to China. Lutnick said the latest framework includes plans to ease some of those US restrictions, although he did not provide specific details. Let's listen in to what Secretary Lutnick had to say.
We have reached a framework to implement the Geneva consensus and the call between the two presidents, right? So that was on June 5th. So we've combined those two. We've reached a framework for implementation. Now the process will be, we're both going to go back. We, Ambassador Greer, myself, and Scott Bessent, who just left a little earlier, which you saw, because he's testifying tomorrow on the Hill. So the idea is we're going to go back and speak to President Trump and make sure he approves it. They're going to go back and speak to President Xi and make sure he approves it. And if that is approved, we will then implement the framework that we have worked hard over these last 2 days.
Meanwhile, China's Vice Commerce Minister Li Qiangang confirmed the agreement in a separate briefing. He characterized the talks as thorough and constructive, noting that the framework will now be reviewed by leaders in both countries. Let's hear from Vice Commerce Minister Li Qiangang.
In principle, both sides agreed on implementing the consensus reached by the two heads of state on the June 5th in the phone calls and also the Geneva talks.
As part of the agreement, Secretary Lutnick also stressed that lifting China's export bans on rare earth minerals and magnets will be a key component of the new trade framework. Let's listen in.
Absolutely expect that the topic of rare earth minerals and magnets with respect to the United States of America will be resolved in this framework implementation. That is a fundamental part of that. Also, there were a number of measures the United States of America put on when those rare earths were not coming. You should expect those to come off sort of, as President Trump said, in a balanced way. When they approve the licenses, then you should expect that our export implementation will come down as well.
We're now joined by Andrew K.P. Lung, who's a China strategist located in Hong Kong. Thank you very much, Andrew, for joining us on the program. Andrew, I want to start about this deal, the possibility of lifting these rare earth export restrictions. Why is this such an important component of these US-China trade talks?
Well, because the rare earths is China's stranglehold on the Achilles heel of Americans' not only economy, but its military. Because China processes about 90% of the world's critical clear rare earth elements. For example, the rare earth known as salarium, China produces almost 100%. And this particular rare earth, which requires a great deal of processing, a lot of them is polluting and highly complicated processes which China has developed over decades. Apart from the extraction of this element, again, extremely polluting. This particular rare earth salarium, for example, is used in F-35 fighters and also in missile weaponry, because this is a kind of heat-resistant magnet which no other countries on Earth is producing. Now, this is only one of the examples. There are many, many different kinds of rare earths which find their used and embedded in various products, high technology products, defense industries, installations, all over the whole spectrum. The fact remains that even though China does not possess the deposits of all of these rare earths, China accounts for about 70% of the supply. But what is more important is the processing. China controls about 90% of the entire spectrum of processing of these rare earths, because each rare earth requires a different intricate process depending on the final component or product, and it requires a great deal of expertise and also infrastructure equipment, which China has been developing over decades. Because as I said, I mean, lots of this looting, and then the United States, even though it has access to rare earths, but only in one single state, accounting for only about 15% of the world's supply. But the most important thing is the processing. No other country can compare China. So I think that China is using this as a negotiating ploy. But of course, the trade tariffs are playing havoc on both sides. American economy, there's inflation, and also prices going up for American people, and of course China's economy is affected. So I think that both sides see that that's not the solution, because there is a huge imbalance in trade, in investments, in access to technology on both sides, and that's the reason why both sides choose to sit down and work it out. Now, the most important thing that this is a framework agreement, because as far as China's negotiation tactic or philosophy is concerned, it is not negotiating clause by clause, because the agreement on one clause could affect the agreement on others. For example, China wants the access to some of the critical technologies. If that is denied, it could impact on China's willingness to ease some of the restrictions on rare earths and other clauses. And hence, that is the need to develop a framework agreement so that both sides can go back to their capitals to see whether the whole framework is doable, because it contains both concessions as well as bonds.
Andrew, this, as you've just mentioned, this is a framework. They haven't finalised a deal here. What political hurdles must President Trump and President Xi jump over to finalise this deal, and what ways might this affect the wider impact of US-China relations?
Well, the wider context is, of course, there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States that China represents an existential threat to American dominance. China has now become the largest exporter, the largest manufacturer by a long shot across the whole spectrum of manufacturing, including shipping. And for example, China produces almost 70 or 90% of all the world's ships, and that will affect the strength of the U.S. Navy. And let alone the rare earths. But of course, China is embedded in the whole world supply and value chain. But I think that American also sees that there is an imbalance in trade, because American wants to sell more products to China, and there are certain restrictions or lack of access. And also, one critical issue is the perception of China's state subsidies. But of course, there are subsidies in the United States, for example, in the defense industry, the Biden sort of the CHIPS Act, and so on. So I think that both sides need to look at to the extent that they can compromise on certain issues. But basically, at the end of it all, the China model is very different from the American model. It is a mixture between capitalism and state intervention. It's unlikely that China would change the system entirely, but how to arrive at some sort of a compromise so that both sides then get what they want to promote a more stable relationship in the future.
Yes, Andrew KP Leung, thank you for joining us on the program. For our next story, we move over to the United States, and Boeing